So in this video, I'm going to give a very basic kind of photo one level explanation of shutter speed and aperture and how they let light into your camera, and then how you can control them both with a camera and a phone. Again, this is a photo one level. I'm not even going to talk about ISO, but I do have a video at a more advanced level that talks about that. So first of all, when you have a camera, uh, it has two parts to it, whether it's a digital camera or film camera. It will have two parts. It will have a lens and it has the body. So in the body is something called a shutter. So this is the inside of a film camera where you can pop open the back and there's a shutter. It's like a curtain. It's also sometimes called a curtain, and it opens and closes, and it can open and close very quickly or very slowly or somewhere in between. But as it opens and closes, light can come in, and with a film camera, it hits film, which is sensitized to light, or in a digital camera, it hits a sensor that also is sensitized to light, and then it records it digitally. So the shutter, a curtain opens and closes, and light comes in. Before it even gets to the shutter, it goes through the lens. So in the lens, you have a hole, and it's called an aperture. You actually have this in your own body. It's the pupils in your eyes. So, you know how sometimes they're bigger when there's not a lot of light around because they need to let in more light so you can see. Or if it's super bright out, they get very small because they don't want to let as much light in, because then there'd be too much light and you couldn't see anything, you'd be blinded. So camera lens works in the same kind of way. You can make it bigger, you can make it smaller. When it's bigger, it lets more light in. When it's smaller, it lets in less light. So why are there different settings? So a very kind of simple explanation is because they look different. The more complicated explanation has to do with the fact that different lighting or different situations have different amounts of light and everything. But in terms of functionally as a photographer, we like to control these things because they look different. So when you have that big open hole, that big open aperture in your lens, you get something called shallow depth of field. And when it's small, you get greater depth of field. And then when you have a slow shutter speed, it opens, something moves, it closes, it's captured all that movement, you get blurred motion. And when it's fast, you get frozen motion. So let's talk about these in a little bit more depth. So here we have, there's all different settings. They're called f-stops. And of course, the bigger one lets in more light and the smaller one lets in less light. And the visual effect, again, but with some examples so you can see, is when you have shallow depth of field, that means only part of the picture is in focus. Only part of the picture is in focus. So his face is in focus, the guy in the background's out of focus. The hands are in focus, the background's out of focus. The curtain and the window frame are in focus, out of focus, focus, out of focus. So it actually has to do with depth. Now, if we have a camera that has manual settings on it, so you probably have a dial, something like this, whether it's a digital camera or like a DSLR, or it could even be a mirrorless camera. Again, in my next video, in my more advanced video, I talk about shooting manually and how shutter speed and aperture interact with each other. But on a photo one level, you should know that if you want to control these things on your camera, you can use something called aperture priority, and that works by putting it to A for aperture if you have a Nikon, AV, aperture variable, if you have a Canon, and you want to choose a lower f-stop number. So there'll be some kind of dial on your camera or a button or something that you'll see where an F is and a number, and you're able to make that higher and lower. So some examples of some f-stops that will give you more shallow depth of field is like f4, f3.5, f2, f1.4. F1.2 would be super shallow depth of field. And so again, if you're using a camera, put it on A or AV and choose a lower f-stop number. And I'll explain at the end of this video how you do it on a phone. Now, Extra tips. You can't take a shallow depth of field photo of like a brick wall or something flat. You have to have things different distances away because, again, depth of field has to do with depth, it has to do with distance. It's a physical thing. And so you have to have things different distances away from the camera. Also, it helps to kind of force some depth of field when you're using a camera by focusing on something that's about like 3 to 5 feet away from the camera. And that helps force that shallow depth of field. Let's say that you were out in the countryside and there was a horse in front of you and a barn in the background and then some trees much farther away. If you focus on the horse and you use, A and AV and these lower f stops, that will help you get the barn and the background out of focus. However, even with those same settings, if you focused on the barn or the trees in the background, it actually makes it harder to create shallow depth of field. So you definitely want to focus on something within 3 to 5 feet. Now we have the small aperture, that small hole in the lens. And that shows greater depth of field. So these guys are in focus, and the tree in the back is in focus. The bike rider's in focus. The bridges in the background are in focus. The guy with the scythes in focus. We can see the house. And this picture, the reflections are in focus. The bridge is in focus. Even I think that's like half dome, which is really far away, miles and miles and miles away. It's all in focus. So that is greater depth of field. So like everything's in focus. Again, this is simplification because you can be somewhere in the middle, but we're just talking about kind of the extremes here. So if you're using a camera, put it on A or AV because you're telling your camera, like, hey, I want to work with aperture right now. So put it on A or AV, but this time choose a higher f stop. So you'll use your little dial or your little buttons to choose something more like f11, f16, f22, to choose a higher, to get greater depth of field. And some little tips is that you have to have objects at different distances away. Again, you can't show greater depth of field really in something that's flat because it's one depth of field. You know what I mean? So um, so you have to have things different distances away to show that the thing close to us and the thing far away, that the horse is in focus, the barn is in focus, and those trees in the background are in focus. Also, it helps, it's just the opposite from before, to focus on something farther away, to focus on that barn, to focus on the trees in the background. And that, again, will help create greater depth of field. Now, let's talk about that shutter speed. So, that thing in the body of the lens that opens and closes for different amounts of time. It is measured in fractions. These are fractions of a second. And, just like fractions always are, when you have a lower denominator, you have more of something. If you have 1/2 of a pizza, that's certainly a lot more pizza than 1/1000th of a piece of pizza. So whenever you have a lower denominator, that means you actually have more of something, and you have a higher denominator, that means you have less of something. And here we're talking about time. So this is more time, which gives light more of a chance to come into the camera. And it also creates a chance to capture more motion happening in front of the camera. And when you have a faster shutter speed, it's less time and less light coming in. And so it kind of freezes motion. So let's look at some examples. So the visual effect of a slow shutter speed is anything that's moving is blurred. These two people are walking, so they're blurred. These two women are just standing there, so they're not blurred. The sand is not moving, so it's not blurred. So you want only the things that are moving to be blurred. Here we have, the buildings aren't blurred because they're not moving, but the buses are. She's just standing there, probably on her phone, and the ground is not moving. So they are not blurred, but this is blurred motion. Here, these people are walking. She's standing still. That's why they are blurred and she is not. So here we're going to use shutter priority. And when in these priority modes, we control like what the aperture is in aperture priority, or we control shutter for shutter priority. Your camera then will pick the opposite. You know, if you're doing shutter priority, it picks the aperture. If you're shooting in aperture priority, it picks the shutter. Again, in my second level video, I explain how to put it on manual so you can control both. But this is a nice, easy way to shoot where you get some control, but it's a good, like, kind of photo one level or intro to photo class level. So you put your camera on S if you have a Nikon, or TV, which is my understanding that means time variable for a Canon, and you shoot with a lower denominator. Remember, the lower the denominator, the more you have of something. So 1/30th of a second, 1/15th, 1/8th, 1/4th, something like that. You have to have something moving in the frame though, right? I can't just take a picture of blurred motion of a chair, right? Unless someone is throwing that chair across the room. So you have to have something that's moving. Also, you must hold the camera still. Otherwise, even non-moving things will be blurred, and you don't want that. So you have to hold the camera still, right? Because let's say that here you also moved the camera. That would mean the ground and the buildings would all be a blur as well. And that's not the effect that we're going for. That doesn't look professional. So you have to hold the camera still. So some advice for holding the camera still is, the worst way to hold your camera is far away from your body. The best way is to be like a T-Rex. Plant your feet nice and wide, have short little arms. We can see that here, right? That holds the camera closer to your body. It's a little bit more braced. Maybe plant your elbows on something, maybe lean your body up against a wall, or maybe place it on a timer, or use a tripod and put it on something, on a table or a chair or something that's not moving. But we need to hold that camera still. Otherwise, the camera will pick up the movement of your hands and everything will be blurred. So now the opposite of a slow shutter speed is a fast shutter speed. So probably you see, definitely in sports photos, you're going to see things frozen in time. And this is really interesting for human beings to look at, because our eyes don't work like this. Our eyes work like video cameras. We see everything moving one thing into another. Our brains cannot freeze. If we throw an apple in the air, our brains can't freeze that apple in the air. It just watches it move up and come down. So it's really kind of cool to see things that are frozen motion. So this dog shaking, or this water polo player. So it's really interesting to us as human beings, because this is not the way we usually see the world. So guess what we do? We put our camera on S or TV, and we choose a higher denominator, something like 1/125, 250, 500, 1,000. I have a camera that goes up to 1/8,000th of a second. So you want a faster shutter speed. And again, you have to have something that's moving, and it should be something interesting. If you see a car drive by and you get a frozen motion, guess what? It's just going to look like that car is parked. So you want to do something more kind of fun, water coming out of a hose, or throwing leaves up in the air, or go down to the beach and some waves hitting the rocks, something like that. You want to have something super interesting. Throw your dog a frisbee. And capture it frozen in the air. So you want to find something interesting. And that's basically how you control your shutter speed and your aperture. Now, a couple extra just kind of notes. If you're using a flash, turn it off. You got to turn your flash off. If you have your flash on, it's going to probably like override a bunch of those things. There is a way to use flash with blurred motion and frozen motion and stuff, but it's kind of more advanced and it has more advanced settings. But for now, if you're taking these pictures, you want to turn your flash off. Also, don't forget about all the active choices that I've talked about in my other lessons and videos. Just because you're thinking about shutter speed and aperture, don't forget about shadows, light, visual organization, line, shape, texture, positive, negative space. Think about your focal length and your orientation and your angles and rule of thirds and your timing and your eye space, all that kind of stuff. we are learning all these things along the way so we can have them in our toolbox and use them to build the best picture that we can. We don't use all the tools at once. We don't do all of these. But definitely when you're taking like a fast shutter speed photo, you still want to be aware. I don't want clutter in the background. Ooh, there's some cool shadows over there. Why don't I incorporate shadows into this picture too? It adds a layer of complexity, that kind of thing. So think about all that. Now you're probably wondering, how does all of this, like, how do I, if I'm going to use my phone, how do I do this on my phone? Well, let's look at that. One thing that you can use is the Adobe Lightroom mobile app. In the past, there's a free version. It doesn't have as many controls, but you should be able to use it. There are probably other apps as well, either free or that you can pay for, but I will show you how to use the Lightroom app. So when you open the Lightroom app, you want to be in the library and click on the blue oval and click on the camera, right? And when you first open it up, it will probably say auto down here, but we want it to say pro or professional. So click on that and choose professional. And then look what comes up. All these other options. And one of them is SEC, like seconds. And so when we click on that, we have this little slider and we can go up and down and choose a shutter speed. So if you want to choose a shutter speed on your phone, you can use the Lightroom app, uh, make it pro, click on SEC and slide that back and forth. Now, I mean, 1/4 of a second to 1/10,000th of a second. This is definitely not letting in much light. Your picture might be way too dark. This is definitely a lot of light. Your picture will be way too light. So you, again, want to use something more like 1/30th of a second, 1/60th of a second for blurred motion, and one maybe 500th of a second for a fast shutter speed. And, let's maybe start there and then move it up and down and kind of experiment to find what shutter speed works the best. So that is how you control your shutter speed. Now, in terms of other things that are here, I'm just going to talk real quick about manual focus to kind of lead into talking about aperture on a phone. Aperture is harder to control. We either force it or fake it. So actually, I'm going to go real quick to talk about forcing shallow field and then back to the manual focus. So when you have a phone, if you get very close to something, like I'm talking about 4 inches away from it, and you click and hold and focus on something very close to you, it forces shallow depth of field, right? So you can do that. Or like when you're in this manual focus, you can actually kind of pick what you want to focus on. And whatever is outlined in green in the Lightroom app, that is going to be what is in focus. So you'll see, like right now, it's focusing more on that than it is the stuff in the background. So you can click on your manual focus and slide it back and forth and see what it's like to focus on something in the background or focus on something in the foreground. But generally, you want to focus on something much closer. So even in like the native iPhone app, you don't even have to be in the Lightroom app. You can click and hold on something very close, again, about like 4 inches away, and it will force shallow depth of field. Now, the problem is you don't always want to be 4 inches away. Sometimes you want to take a picture of your friend or something else, or you don't want to be all up in their face. So you can use portrait mode. Now, portrait mode on a phone, on an iPhone particularly, it's not like real life. It's AI. It's a computer program. It does this thing called depth mapping where it tries to figure out what the object is, finds those edges of the object, figures out as things move away, getting further and further away, is it like digitally um, fuzzes it out, right? So it's a digital effect. It's not a photographic process. It's not actually built on real life depth as much. And sometimes it can have problems. So see here, like it thought this was the edge, but it fuzzed. It didn't understand the top of the glass. It thought it was in the background, so it made it out of focus. So there are problems sometimes with it. And I have another video where I actually show it like in practice, and you can see some of the errors, like while I'm taking pictures, some of the errors that it can make. But on the other hand, sometimes it does work really well. Like in this picture, it works really well because, again, it's trying to find the edges. So it'll keep whatever the subject is in the front in focus and make everything else out of focus. Um, so you just choose portrait mode, and actually you can see up in the corner it has f-stops. So you can click on that if you want, and then there's a slider and slide back and forth. And I would recommend, instead of shooting all the way at like f1.4, whatever the lowest one is, which kind of looks too shallowed up the field, it looks too fake, I would dial it down a little bit and choose something more like f2.5, something like that. So the background does look out of focus, but it's not like super, super fake looking. The nice thing too, at least on an iPhone, when you take a picture of portrait mode, you can actually open it back up in the editor and change the f-stop afterwards. So if you take a picture and you're like, wait, I want that to be more out of focus in the background, or I want it to be less shallow depth of field, you can change that later. Um, it will actually tell you when you take a picture to move farther away sometimes, because it needs to be a certain distance away. So again, you can force shallow depth of field when you get really close to something, but if you want to be further away from something, then you can use the portrait mode and fake shallow depth of field. Greater depth of field is like not really a problem. Your phone wants to do that anyway. So you just, I don't know, just open up your phone, just regular phone app, and you can just click on something farther away, and focus on something farther away, as we mentioned earlier, and that will help create greater depth of field. So, one final note, if you do take pictures in Lightroom, then it doesn't save directly into your camera roll. It saves it in Lightroom. So you're just going to have to click on this little icon and say export to camera roll. So that's just like a little tip for you. So I do have this video. I will put it in the description of the video that I'm making right now. And like I show a screen video of me using these things on a phone. Also, I would say that here, let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Um, you can pause this video right now, and these are kind of step by step. So take shallow depth of field pictures, you can force it or fake it. This is how you force it. This is how you fake it. To take the greater depth of field, this is what you do. And again, you can pause this and read this, but take the blurred motion photo, use the Lightroom mobile app, make sure that it says Pro, hold the camera still, choose a SEC for seconds, and to take the frozen motion, it's the same thing, but choose a higher denominator. And of course, have something moving in both of them. So hopefully this helps. I know it's a long video, but I hope it helps. If you have any questions, just please let me know.